Let me tell you a story today. So moving, so quietly beautiful, that it just might stir something deep inside you. Set in the middle of the Wild West, where wind whispers through broken boards and forgotten trails, it's a place where healing hides in the most unexpected hands. It all began with a few silent evenings and a choice no one dared to offer before. You don't have to leave. Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The daylight slipped away faster than usual that evening, dropping behind the tall ridges as if someone had dragged a curtain across the sky. Cold rolled in right behind it, settling over the land in a hard, biting hush. Zeke Callahan guided his weary horse along the packed earth toward his cabin. The gelding's hooves beat a slow, steady rhythm, sending pale dust drifting with each gust that curled up from the valley below. His shoulders stayed tense without him even realizing it. Old scouting habits never truly died. His eyes swept the land the way they once scanned narrow trails, always searching for movement, always listening for something out of place. At 38, he had the rugged strength of a man who worked cattle every day, but the way he sat the saddle carried more years than he claimed. His coat was patched at the elbows, the wool shirt beneath sun-bleached and winter-worn. Stubble darkened his jaw, and fine lines at the corners of his eyes spoke of too many sleepless nights spent waiting for trouble that never came. He lived out here by choice. After leaving military life behind, he drifted through a couple towns but couldn't stomach the noise or the prying eyes. So he settled at Dry Rock Ridge, a quiet piece of land where a man could breathe without answering to anyone. His life was simple now. Watch the fence line, keep the cattle safe, guard the silence. He trusted routine more than people. So when he rounded the last bend and spotted a figure standing near his porch, a sharp punch of alarm hit his chest. He jerked the reins, and his horse lifted its head, sensing the tension pouring off him. Zeke steadied his breath as he tried to make sense of what stood before him. A woman, thin, unsteady, hugged her arms around herself as though trying to keep from falling apart. The first thing he noticed was her bare feet on the frozen ground, toes raw from exposure. Her long black hair hung in uneven braids, several strands torn loose and whipping across her face in the wind. Her sun-bronzed skin was scraped along her arms and legs, and her deerskin dress was ripped at the shoulder, torn open as if someone had grabbed her or she'd torn free while running. She attempted to straighten her back when she saw him, but her legs trembled so badly she had to grip the porch post just to stay upright. Even from where he sat, Zeke could see the uneven rise of her breath. Shallow, hurried, the kind of breathing that belonged to someone trying and failing to hide fear. She had been running for 2 days before reaching his land, fleeing the forced marriage the Redthorn men had tried to pin her into, and the men who chased her hadn't given her a moment's rest. She had avoided the roads, crawled through brush, walked with no food, moving until her legs simply gave out. She ended up at his ranch because her body had nothing left to push farther. Zeke didn't know the details yet, but he knew enough to recognize someone who hadn't come willingly. He slowed his horse to a stop. His heartbeat thudded harder, an old instinct rising again. Was she hurt? Was someone after her? Was this a setup? He scanned the land carefully, checking behind the sagebrush, sweeping the ridge for riders. Nothing. Just the dead, still stretch of open country. When he looked back, she stared at him with wide, exhausted eyes. Her jaw tightened as if she were trying to speak, but the words died before they hit the air. Zeke swung down from the saddle, landing with a heavy thump. He didn't reach for his rifle. Moving too fast scared desperate people, and she already looked a breath away from collapsing. She lifted her hands slightly, not in surrender, but offering something before he could turn her away. "I can work," she managed, her voice breaking. "Cook, clean, anything. If you let me stay, just for tonight, I won't cause trouble." Her voice cracked again, the sound thin and strained. She stared at the ground, ashamed to beg but too desperate to do anything else. Something tightened low in Zeke's chest. He hated when folks felt the need to trade labor for decency. But her shaking fingers, the way her ribs pressed painfully beneath the torn dress, she was starving, freezing, terrified. And he remembered standing alone in the dark once, too, unsure if he'd live to see dawn. He wasn't a man of many words. He opened his saddlebag and pulled out a folded wool blanket, kept for bad winters or cold nights on the trail. Without stepping too close, he held it out. "You don't owe me," he said, voice steady. She didn't answer at first. Confusion flickered across her face. People didn't give things without demanding something back. Her gaze darted between his hand and the blanket, almost expecting him to snatch it away if she hesitated. Finally, she reached for it, gripping the thick wool with both hands and holding it tight to her chest. Her breath stayed fast but lost some of its wild panic. Zeke stepped back and pushed the cabin door open. The hinges groaned low in the cold. He didn't tell her to come in. He simply made space, letting her choose for herself. Zeke stepped aside without a word, letting her make her choice. Nayeli paused just a breath, then moved through the doorway, careful, like her legs might give out at any moment. The air inside the cabin carried the scent of pine and old smoke, the kind that clung to wood through long winters. A tin stove sat near the back wall, throwing off faint warmth. A small table stood beneath the narrow window, and a rolled-up bed lay tucked against the far corner. The room was simple. Nothing fancy, nothing wasted. Zeke followed her in and shut the door behind them. Wind struck the wood a second later, rattling the frame, and she flinched. Her hands clutched the blanket tighter around her shoulders. She moved toward the stove, stopping only when her calves hit the stool beside it. Zeke shrugged off his coat and hung it on a peg by the door. His voice came quiet but sure. "Sit. Warm yourself." She eased onto the stool, slow and cautious, curling her bare feet inward toward the floorboards, hoping to soak in what little heat there was. She didn't look his way. Her eyes stayed fixed on the fire, like it was the only thing holding her together. Zeke checked the window latch, pushing it down again out of habit. Not because of her. He did it every time. But he noticed her watching, studying his movements like a caged bird watching a man's hand. In her mind, Nayeli wrestled the urge to apologize for stepping into this space. She didn't know whether to speak or stay quiet. Her instincts screamed to stay small, invisible. She didn't know what kind of man Zeke Callahan really was, if his kindness would sour, if he was just waiting to decide what she was worth. In Zeke's mind, the thoughts ran quiet but steady. He didn't trust strangers, didn't want anyone in his world, but he sure as hell couldn't shove her back out into the cold. That kind of decision would eat at a man's gut. The cabin stayed silent, save for the wind at the walls and the crackle of firewood in the stove. Two people with heavy pasts, sharing a room with more questions than answers. Zeke finally moved to the stove, poured warm broth from a dented pot, and placed the cup on the table near her. She glanced at it. Then at him. He stepped back, giving her space. It was a small gesture, but it changed everything. Nayeli wrapped both hands around the cup and drank slow, the heat steadying her breath, softening the shiver in her bones. Zeke sat on the far side of the room, close enough to watch over her, far enough not to press. He waited for the night to settle. The fear in her shoulders eased by degrees, and in that quiet space between them, a thread of trust began to take root. Not built on words, but on his choice to offer warmth without asking anything in return. Wind picked up after nightfall, brushing hard against the cabin, making the door shudder in its frame. Nayeli curled tighter in the blanket, feet drawn close to the stove. The cold had sunk deep in her bones and wouldn't leave easy. Zeke watched her from across the room, leaning forward in his chair, elbows resting on his knees, fingers loosely folded. He wasn't staring. He was reading her, her condition, her fear, how close she was to blacking out. After a long moment, she lifted her eyes, voice barely above a breath. "Do you live alone?" "Yeah," Zeke answered, plain. She hesitated, then asked, "How long?" "Years." Nayeli nodded like she already figured as much. She looked away again, sensing his short reply was a wall she didn't want to press. Still, she wanted to understand the man who'd opened his door with no questions asked. She rubbed the edge of the blanket, grounding herself in something solid. Zeke moved to the stove, stirring the pot again. The motion, small as it was, made her flinch, shoulders tightening like she'd braced for something worse. He slowed down immediately. "You're safe here," he said. He didn't look her way, just kept his voice calm and sure. She nodded once, but her body didn't fully believe him yet. He ladled more broth into the cup and placed it on the table again. "Drink." She lifted it carefully, the steam rising into her face. "Thank you," she whispered. Zeke gave a small nod. He didn't want her to feel like she owed him. He wasn't looking for gratitude, but silence would have felt colder than it should. While she drank in slow sips, Zeke checked the windows again, pushing on the frames lightly to be sure they held. Nayeli followed his movements, turning her head with slow, deliberate care. "You keep checking," she said softly. "Habit." "For what?" "Anything that don't belong out there." She took that in. One sentence, but it told her more about him than he likely meant to reveal. Zeke wasn't paranoid. He was a man who'd seen enough to know better. Nayeli shifted, letting out a small wince as the edge of the blanket brushed her ribs. Zeke saw her breath catch. "Those bruises?" he asked. She dropped her eyes. "I hit a tree branch or a rock. I don't remember." He didn't buy it, but he didn't press. Her voice said more than the words ever could. Her voice told him more than the words ever could. Zeke watched her for another moment, reading the tremble she tried so hard to hide. Her body was giving out, plain and simple, bone-tired and worn raw by fear. He stepped away from the stove and moved to the corner where he kept his extra bedding. "You can sleep here by the stove," he said. "The floor's warmer up close." "I can sleep anywhere," she said quickly. Too quick, too sharp, like she'd taken offense, like she feared being seen as a burden. "I know," he replied, "but you'll warm up faster here." He laid the blanket down without another word. Nayeli rose slow, masking the pain in her movements, walking like each step was measured. When she finally settled on the floor, she pulled the blanket tight and tucked her knees beneath it, her gaze darting around the room like she was memorizing every door, every escape. Zeke blew out the smaller lantern, leaving only the stove's soft orange glow licking at the walls. Then he rolled out his own bedroll near the far wall, keeping distance, deliberate, calm, protective. He lay back, but didn't drift. His body rested. His mind stayed sharp, watching shadows. Nayeli could feel it. He was still alert. She shifted once, then again. Couldn't settle. Couldn't trust it enough yet to let go. Then, almost like a whisper, she spoke into the dim light. "Are you gonna want something from me?" Her voice cracked under the weight of the question. Zeke turned his head slightly, didn't rise, didn't move toward her. "No," he said, simple as stone. She drew a shaky breath. "Then, why help me?" He let the silence stretch, memories flickering like ghosts behind his eyes. He thought of cold marches in deep winter, of scouts bleeding in the snow, of voices crying out that he'd never forget. He pushed it down and answered softly. "You're cold. That's reason enough." She stared into the fire then, her face caught between disbelief and something she hadn't dared feel in too long. Relief. She laid down fully at last, tucking the blanket beneath her chin. Her breathing came shallow at first, then steadier, the warmth loosening something in her chest. Slowly, her body began to yield to sleep. Zeke kept his eyes on the door a while longer. The bruises on her ribs, the way she'd trembled on the porch, how she kept looking back like hell itself was chasing her. He didn't need her to admit it. He knew someone had been on her trail. He listened. To the wind, to the roof creaking, to the whisper of pine outside. No hoofbeats, no voices, just the sound of Nayeli's breath finally easing into sleep. Still guarded, but wrapped in the first safety she'd known in days. Only then did Zeke allow his eyes to close. The choice already made in silence. She would stay. She needed shelter. And he would watch over her, not because she owed him, not because he needed to, but because in a land this cold, people only survived when someone chose not to walk away. By the time the moon climbed high, the fire had burned low. The stove's soft glow lit only half the cabin, the corners left dark and still. Nayeli lay curled by the stove, cocooned in the wool blanket he'd given her. But she wasn't fully asleep. Her breaths came shallow, ragged, caught somewhere between exhaustion and fear. The kind of sleep where the body rests, but the mind refuses to. Zeke lay on his back, arm bent beneath his head, staring at the ceiling. His eyes adjusted to every shadow. His ears caught each noise outside, the wind across the roof, a loose shutter tapping, the call of a night bird in the distance. Harmless sounds. Still, he listened. Years of scouting didn't leave a man, even when he tried to bury them under quiet. Nayeli stirred with a soft whimper before biting it back. Her fingers clutched the blanket tighter. Zeke sat up slightly. "You awake?" She didn't answer right away. Her breath shook. Then, so quiet he almost didn't catch it, she whispered, "Sometimes I still hear them, when I'm falling asleep, the ones chasing me." He didn't move toward her. Didn't need to. He knew better than to close in on someone who'd been hunted. "It's just the wind," he said calmly. "I know," she whispered back. "But my body still thinks it's them." Zeke understood that more than he cared to admit. That instinct to flinch long after the danger was gone. He stayed where he was, elbows on his knees, voice low and even. "You're inside now. No one's getting through that door without me hearing it." She nodded, but her shoulders stayed tight, her eyes flickering between the windows and the frame, like she half expected something to come bursting through. She shifted again, letting out a sharp breath as her ribs pulled. Zeke noticed her hand drifting to her side, pressing gently without drawing attention. "How bad's the pain?" he asked. "They hurt," she answered honestly. "But they're just bruises." "How long you had 'em?" "Since yesterday morning." That explained her shallow breathing, the way she tried to sit straighter than her body would allow. He thought about offering to wrap them up, but wasn't sure how she'd take being touched. Instead, he just said quietly, "We'll take a look in the morning. Better light." She didn't argue. That silence told him the pain was worse than she was letting on. Another gust slammed the door. The cabin rattled. Zeke didn't flinch, but he noticed. She did. Nayeli flinched so hard the blanket slipped off her shoulder. She reached for it fast, but Zeke could see her fingers trembling. You want the lantern lit? He asked. No, she replied quickly. The dark's fine. But it wasn't. Not really. Her voice said one thing, but fear still lingered behind her words. Zeke didn't press. He stayed upright, eyes on the door, listening to every shift in the wind, every groan from the timber walls. You get any sleep out there before finding this place? He asked after a pause. Not much, she murmured. Every sound felt like a warning. If I stopped listening, I was afraid they'd catch me. Her voice broke at the end. She pressed her lips together, trying to pull herself back together. She didn't want to look weak in front of him. But Zeke understood that kind of fear. The kind that forces a person to act stronger than their body can keep up with. After a beat, he said, You can sleep here. I'll stay up a while. She turned toward him, startled by the offer. Her posture shifted, caught somewhere between caution and comfort. You don't have to do that. I know, he said. But I will. Her eyes stayed on him longer this time, like she was searching for the hook behind the kindness. But there was nothing in his face to give her doubt. She laid back down, pulled the blanket up, and held it tight to her chin. Her breathing was still uneven, but slower now. Minutes passed before her voice drifted out, low and fragile. I didn't mean to come here. Didn't know anyone lived out this far. Zeke's voice came steady. You came where your legs carried you. I thought maybe I'd made a mistake. You didn't, he answered, without hesitation. The quiet that followed held more weight than words. Nayeli finally closed her eyes. Zeke stayed awake long after her breathing softened into rhythm. His thoughts slipped to old memories, ambushes, voices calling his name, the men he couldn't save. That's why he'd built his life in silence, far from the rest of the world. He pushed the memories down, the way he always did when they crept too close. When the fire dipped too low, he rose quietly and added a small log, careful not to wake her. She didn't stir, but her body shifted slightly, something in her finally relaxing. It was the first time all night she looked like she might truly sleep. Zeke laid back down on his side, facing the door, one hand near the floor, close to where his rifle leaned. He wasn't expecting trouble, but he wasn't taking any chances either. The night stretched on, bitter cold and silent, but something had shifted. Two strangers, hours ago, now shared a space not just in walls, but in trust. She slept because deep down she believed he would keep watch. And he stayed awake because without ever saying it, he'd taken that responsibility. First light crept in quiet, just a thin gray beam slipping through the patched window. The fire had burned low, leaving only a faint glow behind the stove's iron door. Cold returned, filling the room with misty breath. Zeke opened his eyes before the sun broke the ridge. He'd only caught bits of sleep, waking every time the wind changed, every time a twig snapped outside. He sat up slowly, listening. Nothing. No hoofbeats, no voices. Just stillness in the yard beyond the walls. He looked to where Nayeli lay curled near the stove. One hand beneath her cheek, the other gripping the blanket. Even in sleep, her brow stayed tight, like her dreams couldn't quite let her rest. Zeke watched her, not out of curiosity but out of caution. He checked her breathing, made sure she hadn't slipped into shock from exhaustion. When he was certain she was steady, he stepped outside quietly. The cold hit harder than he'd expected. Frost covered the grass and fence rails, sparkling pale under the low clouds. He circled the cabin, boots crunching soft on the frozen dirt. His eyes caught faint depressions in the earth. Boot tracks. Old? Not quite. A day? Maybe two. too shallow to know which way they came from, but enough to stir a knot in his gut. He scanned the horizon, jaw tight. Nothing moved. When he returned, Nayeli was awake. She hadn't left the floor, but her eyes were locked on the door the moment it creaked open. Instinct, defense. Zeke shut it behind him gently. "You're up." She nodded. "Cold woke me." Her voice was low, scratchy from sleep. She sat up slowly, then winced, hand pressed against her ribs. "Let me see," Zeke said, lowering into a crouch near the stove. She shook her head. "It's fine. I'll manage." "You're hurt. Let me look." His voice didn't rise, but it left no room for debate. Still, she hesitated. After days of fleeing from men who saw her as prey rather than a person, the idea of someone laying hands on her, no matter how gentle, felt like walking back into fire. Nayeli took a breath, steeling herself, and lifted a corner of the blanket. Beneath the torn dress, her ribs were darkened with bruises, angry swells of purple and yellow painting a story of violence. Zeke Callahan crouched beside her, eyes narrowing at the sight. He didn't reach for her right away, his jaw clenched. "That from the running?" he asked, voice low. She looked away, offering no answer. But Zeke didn't need one. He grabbed a strip of clean cloth from a crate near his bed. "I'll wrap it." "Hold still," he said gently. Nayeli stiffened, but didn't pull away. Zeke's hands moved with deliberate care, firm enough to support the injury, yet soft as not to spook her. She held her breath at first, then let it out slow, realizing he wasn't there to hurt her. "You're lucky nothing's cracked," he murmured. "You keep moving like this, it will. I won't be here long enough to make it worse." Her voice bristled, like she expected him to toss her out. Zeke tied the cloth tight, clean, and snug. "You're not leaving today." "Why not?" she asked, bracing herself. "You can't walk far, and you know it." Nayeli dropped her gaze. "I didn't plan to stay anywhere. I figured if I just kept moving, I'd be safer." Zeke leaned back on his heels, nodding slowly. "Running don't always keep you ahead." "I know," she said. "But stopping, that felt worse." There was no blame in her voice, just plain, worn-out truth. Zeke stood, walked to the table and poured water from a tin jug. His hands steady, but his thoughts were circling what he'd seen out near the edge of the property. Tracks. Faint, but fresh. Somebody'd been close. Maybe still was. He handed her the tin cup. "Drink." She took it, sipping slow. Her fingers still shook from the cold. Zeke leaned against the table, eyes steady on her. "You said someone was after you." "I didn't say that," she whispered. "You didn't have to." Silence lingered. She looked up, uncertain if she could trust him, unsure if she even should. Her expression softened, but only slightly. She wasn't ready to open that wound. Instead, she asked, "When I can walk, you want me gone? Want your place back the way it was?" Zeke studied her, eyes deep and shadowed with fear, hands clutching the blanket like it was the only anchor she had left. "No," he said flatly. "I want you warm. I want you healed. After that, it's up to you." Something shifted behind her eyes. Not quite relief, but some knot of fear began to loosen. It had been days since anyone gave her a choice instead of an order. Zeke reached for his coat. "I'll check the fence line again. Make sure whoever passed through ain't getting closer." Her eyes widened. "Someone was out there," he said. "Not last night, but maybe this morning. Could be nothing. Could be something." Fear crept across her face like a shadow. She stood too fast, then winced from the pain that lanced through her ribs. Zeke lifted a hand. Not to touch her, just to ease her back down. "You're safe here," he said quietly. "Ain't no one coming through that door without me knowin' first." Nayeli swallowed hard and sat again, pulling the blanket tighter as if she could trap both warmth and trust beneath its folds. Zeke stepped outside, shutting the door soft behind him. She listened as his footsteps faded toward the corral. There was something solid in his movement, something sure, the kind of steady strength that spoke louder than promises. Inside the cabin, the stove crackled as a new log caught fire. Nayeli stared at the door, her heart still running wild. But for the first time since she'd fled the Redthorn men, she didn't feel completely alone. She didn't know what tomorrow might bring, but right now she had a roof, a fire, and someone who wasn't deciding her fate, only protecting it. The morning sun rose higher than it had in days, though its warmth barely kissed the cold dirt. Pale light stretched across Zeke's worn yard, touching the corral, the brittle grass, the splintered fence, and the ground where the tracks had been. He saw them clearly now, faint depressions in the frost-bitten soil. One person, maybe two, passing through or hunting. He crouched low, eyes scanning every detail. The signs were subtle, but he'd read trails long enough to know when someone walked with purpose. Whoever left these steps hadn't wandered aimlessly. Their pace was too even, too slow. Zeke stood, his shoulders tensing with a familiar weight. No need to speak it aloud. He already knew. He'd go about his work, but his eyes would stay sharp. Some things might circle back, and Zeke Callahan knew the girl needed safety more than space. As he made his way back to the cabin, he caught a glimpse of her through the window. Wrapped in that blanket like it was her last piece of armor, Nayeli sat stiff and quiet at the table, her hands rubbing together for warmth, eyes fixed low, avoiding the sting of memory. When Zeke stepped inside, she looked up fast. "You were gone a while," she said, trying to sound casual, though her voice carried the weight of worry. "Just checked the line," Zeke replied. Fence hold steady. She watched him hang his coat, searching his face like a map for any sign of alarm. He was good at keeping steady, but something about the way he moved gave her pause. A heaviness in his steps, eyes that flicked to the windows before he finally sat down. "I can help," she blurted, surprising herself more than him. "Help with what?" he asked, not unkindly. "Anything you need. Sweeping, cooking, cleaning. I can't sit around while you carry all the weight." "You need to rest," Zeke said gently. "Your ribs haven't healed yet." "I can still help." There was steel in her voice now, something that said she wasn't just trying to be useful. She was trying to hold herself together. "If I don't stay busy," she added, "my mind keeps spinning. I keep thinking about them." Zeke understood that all too well. Quiet could be crueler than chaos. He nodded once. "All right. Light work. Nothing that makes those ribs worse." She rose slowly, steadying herself before heading to the corner where his supplies sat. She picked up the broom and gripped it with both hands, grounding herself. Then she began to sweep. The movements were slow, deliberate, but each stroke pulled at her side. She hid the pain behind a mask of focus. "You don't have to go so hard," Zeke said from the table, eyes on the rifle in his hands. "I'm fine." She wasn't. He could see that clear as day. But he knew better than to argue with pride. He cleaned the barrel in long, smooth motions, glancing her way every few moments. She held her back straight, jaw tight, doing everything she could not to seem broken. Zeke respected it, even if she didn't have to prove anything here. Once the floor was swept, she turned to the shelf near the stove, arranging the few items he owned. 10 old tin cups, a worn pot, dried herbs gathering dust. Her hand slipped once, and she braced herself on the stove, jaw clenched tight against the jolt of pain. Zeke rose, walked over, quiet and calm. "That's enough," he said. "I can still do more," she replied stubbornly. "You've done plenty." His voice didn't rise. It didn't have to. It held a calm that cut through her will without bruising it. She paused, then let her shoulders drop and leaned the broom back against the wall. "All right," she whispered. "But I can't just sit around. I need something to do." Zeke nodded toward the table. "Food. You can help with that." She moved to the pot and began preparing broth with careful, almost reverent hands. Zeke poured water from the jug, his movements slow and measured. They worked side by side in silence, not tense, just unused to the rhythm of company. The scent of broth soon filled the cabin, melting some of the morning's chill. When it was ready, Zeke gestured to the table. "You first." She hesitated, then took her seat. He sat across from her, watching as she brought the cup to her lips. Her hands trembled, but she gripped the tin tight to steady them. After a while, she spoke, voice low, almost afraid of the answer. "You never said what you saw out there." Zeke looked up. "You weren't ready to hear it earlier." "I am now. Just tracks, faint ones. Could be nothing." "Or it could be them," she whispered. He didn't respond right away. When he did, his words were careful. "If they were near, you'd have heard 'em before you hit my porch. Sound carries out here. You came alone." Her gaze dropped. "Not because they stopped, because I outran 'em." Zeke studied her. The firelight caught the lines of strain on her face. She looked like someone who'd been walking through fear too long without pause. "You're safe here," he said. "Ain't nothing getting through me." Nayeli held his eyes, and something in her changed. Not full trust, but maybe the start of it. She finished the broth slowly, like it mattered. Zeke cleared the bowls, rinsing them in the basin. She watched, thoughtful. "How long will you let me stay?" she asked. "As long as you need," he replied without looking up. The words landed like a quiet promise, filling a hollow space in her chest. She lowered her eyes, trying to blink back the tears tightening her throat. Zeke Callahan rinsed the last bowl clean and set it upside down on the drying rack. "We'll take it slow today," he said. "I'll tend to things outside. You stay in. Keep warm." Nayeli gave a small nod. No protest, no hesitation. As the door shut behind him, she watched it for a moment, then didn't move. For the first time since fleeing the Redthorn men, the instinct to bolt wasn't clawing at her. Instead, she pulled the wool blanket tighter across her shoulders, stepped closer to the fire, and let her breath ease for once. Slower, deeper. Out in the yard, Zeke moved along the fence line, more alert than usual. Inside, Nayeli ran her fingers gently across the table's edge, smoothing the grain like it was something sacred. For the first time since fate tossed them together, this place didn't feel like a hideout. It felt like maybe it could be something steady. Before noon, the light faded again. A thick wall of clouds rolled in from the west, muting the land's color and letting the wind sigh low across the dry grass. Zeke had just finished fixing a loose rail in the corral, dusted his hands off, and stood a moment longer, eyes scanning the ridge. Those faint tracks he spotted earlier still gnawed at the back of his mind. Faint, sure, but human, not random. Someone had been walking the outer edge of his land. Close enough to matter. He hadn't told Nayeli yet. Didn't want to rattle her. But she was sharp. She always picked up on the little things. When he stepped back up onto the porch, she was already standing at the window, stiff as a board, eyes fixed on the tree line. She spun when the door opened, jaw clenched. "You were gone too long," she said, voice clipped, breath quickened. "Just walked the ridge again," he replied, taking off his gloves and hanging them near the door. No new movement, but she studied his face too closely. She knew. Her voice trembled as she asked, "There were tracks?" Zeke didn't lie. "Yeah, not fresh, but clear. Someone came through." She clutched the blanket tighter, her knuckles pale. "Were they looking for someone?" "Could have been. Could have just been passing. Hard to say." She turned toward the stove, back to him, her breath uneven. The fear wasn't loud in her face, but in how she held herself. Rigid. Braced. Like she expected a slap or a cruel word any second. Zeke stepped over to the table and kept his voice level. "You're safe here." Her eyes lifted, slow and doubtful. "For how long?" "As long as you're in this cabin," he said firmly. "Nobody lays a hand on you." For a beat, something flickered in her eyes. Uncertainty, maybe disbelief. But beneath that, a hint of something she shoved down fast. Relief. She leaned against the wall near the stove, hugging the blanket close. "I didn't think they'd come this far," she whispered. He didn't press, he just waited. People talk when they need to. That's what he'd learned. Finally, after a long stretch of silence, she exhaled hard. "Not all of them were from my band," she said quietly. "Some were traitors, men who deal in flesh, when folks don't pay debts." Her voice hardened. "I don't even know who they were mad at. My band? Me? Maybe both." Zeke felt a bitter taste rise in his throat. He'd known men like that, back in his scouting days. Men who used fear the way others used knives. "Were they tied to your band? Forced the marriage?" he asked. "They didn't care," she muttered. "Trouble's trouble. They just need an excuse." She rubbed at her ribs absently. Zeke noticed the tension in her shoulders and walked over to feed another log into the stove. "You warm enough?" he asked. She nodded, but her hands still trembled slightly. When he sat down at the table again, she looked at him. Really looked this time. Her eyes searched his steady posture, the calm behind his movements. "You don't scare easy, do you?" she asked. Zeke gave a small shrug. "Not scared, just cautious." "Why?" she asked. He rubbed the back of his neck, jaw tightening. "Lost people once," he said finally. "Good people. Didn't move fast enough. Since then, I stay alert." Nayeli's expression softened, not with pity, but with understanding. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "Past is past," Zeke replied. "I just stay ready, that's all." The stove crackled as the log shifted, sending a warm hiss into the room. Outside, the wind shifted again. Nayeli flinched instinctively and turned to the window. Zeke caught it. He stood and stepped forward gently. "Sit down," he said quietly. "You're wearing yourself out, watching that door." She hesitated before approaching the stool, moving with a cautious grace shaped by pain, and something deeper she wouldn't name. As she sat down, she clutched the blanket around her shoulders, her eyes fixed on the frosted window pane. Zeke Callahan took in a breath, then made up his mind. "Come on, I want to show you something." Nayeli stiffened. "What is it?" "Just outside. Stay behind me." She rose slowly, the blanket gripped tight in her fists, her steps light and uneven as she followed. When he pushed open the cabin door, cold air rushed in to sting their cheeks. She hugged the wall, peering past his shoulder. Zeke pointed toward the land beyond the corral. "Look out there." She scanned the open stretch. "Those are the tracks from the Redthorn men," she murmured, voice tight. "And there," he added, pointing farther west. "No tracks that way. No smoke, no horses, no echo bouncing off the ridge." She held her breath and listened. Only the wind brushing dry grass. "You hear anything?" Zeke asked. She shook her head, whispering, "No." "Exactly, it's quiet, because there's no one out there." Her shoulders eased, ever so slightly. The fear in her face dimmed just a little. Zeke gave her space to breathe, to study the horizon until her pulse slowed. Then he stepped back inside, holding the door open without a word. She followed him in. The warmth of the cabin wrapped around them, and she exhaled a trembling sigh. "I thought they'd never stop chasing me," she said. "Every step I took, I swore they were still right behind me." "You're not running anymore," Zeke replied. She looked up, her gaze searching his face. "And you're not either." Their eyes locked. "No," he said quietly. "I don't run from anything these days." The silence that followed wasn't strained. It was heavy but comforting, like two souls carrying burdens that somehow didn't feel so heavy when shared. Something had shifted. They were no longer just strangers under the same roof. Nayeli slowly eased back down onto the stool. Zeke turned to check the pot simmering over the stove. Their movements settled into an unspoken rhythm. Quiet, steady, shared. For the first time since she'd arrived, Nayeli didn't glance nervously at the door every few moments. And Zeke, though he hadn't said it aloud, had drawn a line in his heart. No one would lay a hand on her. Not while she was under his roof. Not while she was healing. Not on his watch. By the time the pale winter sky flattened over the valley, warning of colder hours to come, Zeke had been busying himself with small tasks, splitting kindling, checking the barn latch, walking the yard for anything out of place. But his motions lacked ease. His shoulders were tight. His eyes drifted again and again toward the ridge, the fence line, the northern slope. Nayeli watched him from the window, wrapped tight in the blanket. She knew how to read a man's stance, and his was tense, shoulders rigid, steps a touch too sharp. Trouble was circling his thoughts. She stepped away from the window and lowered herself onto the stool with care, her bruised ribs protesting every inch. After a while, the door creaked open. Zeke stepped in with a bundle of dry kindling in his arms. "You were out there a long time," she said gently. He dropped the wood near the stove. "Sun's sinking faster. Cold's coming on strong." "That's not what I meant," she said, her voice quiet. He paused, the kind of pause a man makes when weighing how much truth to offer. "No new tracks? But that don't mean I'll risk it." Her gaze dropped. A weight of guilt settled in her chest. "You're doing all this because of me." "I'd do it for anyone being hunted," he answered. "You're not trouble. You just needed help." She blinked hard. "Most men don't help for nothing." "I'm not most men," he replied, giving a quiet shake of his head. The silence that followed was different this time, easy, almost warm. A silence full of unsaid things that didn't need words. She shifted on the stool, wincing as pain flared along her ribs. Zeke noticed immediately. "Let me take a look again," he said, stepping closer. "The wrap might have loosened." Her body tensed out of instinct, but she forced herself to nod. "Okay." Zeke knelt beside her. His hands moved slowly, giving her time to follow every motion. He untied the wrap gently. As the pressure eased, Nayeli released a fragile, shaky breath. "Sorry," he murmured. "It's all right," she whispered, though her voice betrayed the pain. The bruises down her side were darker now, blotched and uneven. Zeke studied them with calm hands. But beneath that, anger stirred. Not wild rage, but a cold, quiet fury. Someone had done this. Someone had driven her to flee, broken and scared. "You ran hard," he said. "I had to." Zeke dipped a clean cloth into warm water, wrung it out, and pressed it gently against her bruised ribs. The heat from the cloth drew a soft, involuntary sigh from Nayeli's lips. More relief than pain. Zeke Callahan paused for a breath, then gently continued laying the bandage across the deep bruises. "You've been carrying these for days," he murmured. "I had to," she replied, her voice low. "Breathing too deep slowed me down." His brow tightened, not at her, but at the thought of her pushing through icy nights, half-starved, lungs tight with pain. "Hold still," he said, voice hushed. His hands moved with a careful steadiness, wrapping the cloth snug across her ribs. His fingertips brushed her skin with each motion, and Nayeli had to fight every instinct, screaming to pull away. Years of rough hands had taught her to flinch. But Zeke's touch wasn't like that. It was measured, calm. And for the first time in a long while, something inside her started to ease. When he tied the last knot, she whispered, "You're careful." "I ain't here to hurt you." "I know," she said quickly. "It's just strange, being treated like I matter." Zeke looked up, and something in the weight behind his eyes gave way. "You deserve better than what you've been through." The words caught in her chest. No one had ever told her that without expecting something in return. He rose and stepped back, giving her space. "You should walk a little, not far, just enough to keep your muscles from locking up." Nayeli pushed herself up slowly, steadying with one hand on the table. Zeke didn't reach to help, but he stayed close, just in case. She took a few slow steps across the cabin, every movement sending sparks of pain through her ribs. But she kept going. "Good," he said quietly. "Keep your breathing steady." She nodded, sweat beading at her temples. When she made it back to the stove, she leaned gently against the wall, catching her breath. "You know," her voice barely rose above the fire's crackle, "I didn't think men like you existed." "Men who wrap busted ribs?" he asked dryly. "No. Men who help without taking something for it." Zeke held her gaze for a long beat. Then, evenly, "I want one thing." Her chest tightened. "What? For me to heal?" "That's it." She lowered her eyes, trying to hide the sting that rose there. Zeke stepped back again, giving her space, but he didn't leave. He busied himself with the firewood, watching her from the corner of his eye. Silent, steady, protective, but never invasive. Nayeli stood quietly, his words echoing in her bones. Zeke Callahan hadn't touched her heart, but he'd changed something in the shape of her fear. She didn't know what that meant. Only that when he wrapped her ribs for the first time in ages, she could breathe. The next morning brought a sharper chill, one that clung to the ground long after the sun had started its slow climb. Frost lined the cabin window in delicate threads. Nayeli sat wrapped in a blanket near the stove, breathing slow and shallow against the tight band Zeke had tied the night before. The ache remained, but it no longer threatened to fold her in half with each breath. She could move now, step without dreading the collapse. Zeke stepped inside from the cold, brushing dirt and chill from his coat. He held a sack of potatoes he'd dug from the pit outside. When he saw she was awake, he paused. His eyes scanned her, jaw clenched, body tight. "How's the pain?" he asked. "Better," she replied. "Not good, but better." That's all right, Zeke said as he set the sack on the table. Healing ain't something you rush. She watched him quietly as he washed his hands. Every move he made was deliberate, clean. He'd been like that since the first night, never wasting emotion. And without meaning to, she'd started memorizing the way he moved. He set a pan on the stove and offered her one of the smaller potatoes. Think you can peel this? She took it from him, her fingers brushing his for the briefest moment. A flicker of warmth traveled up her arm, unexpected and unwelcome, but real. She looked down to hide it. Zeke didn't react, though he lingered just a second longer than needed before pulling his hand away. She peeled slow, careful not to strain her ribs. Zeke chopped steadily beside her, the knife tapping a quiet rhythm on the board. The sound soothed her more than she expected. Sleep all right? He asked. Some. I woke up a few times. But you didn't cry out, he noted. I tried not to. You don't have to prove anything here, Zeke Callahan said without looking up, his knife slicing through kindling. Pain's just pain. Nayeli's breath caught. No man had ever spoken like that to her, drawing a line between pain and weakness, and not making her feel small for either. She winced suddenly, hand pressing to her side, breath hitching sharp. Zeke noticed right away. Sit, he told her. I'm fine, she pushed back, straightening up too fast. Zeke stepped closer, not touching, just near enough that his calm presence steadied her. Sit, he repeated, a firm edge underlined with quiet care. That mix, grit wrapped in kindness, cut through her instinct to fight back. She sat. Zeke crouched down beside her again, checking the bandage at her ribs with the same steady hands he'd used yesterday. His fingers brushed her side lightly. This time she didn't flinch. In fact, she leaned slightly toward him before catching herself and freezing. He noticed, but didn't react. Just adjusted the cloth and stepped back. You're pushing too hard, he said gently. I just don't want to look useless. You're not useless, he said, plain and true. You're hurt. Her gaze dropped, shame burning in her chest. The Redthorn men didn't make that distinction. Zeke lifted his head, locked eyes with her. I'm not them. The cabin fell into a hush. Nayeli swallowed, trying to hold steady. Something in his tone, calm, sure, without a trace of judgment, cut deeper than any wound she carried. Later that morning, after a quiet breakfast, Zeke pushed the cabin door open. Come on, some air might do you good. Nayeli hesitated. Is it safe? If there was danger out there, I wouldn't ask. She wrapped the wool blanket tighter around her shoulders and stepped outside. The chill bit through her, but the morning light had a way of lifting weight off her lungs. The land rolled out before them, pale under the frost. No tracks, no movement, no threat. Zeke stood at her side, arms crossed, eyes scanning the ridgeline with a tracker's instinct. She watched his profile, winter softening the edges of his weathered face, the silver at his temples, the measured way he breathed. If they come, she asked quietly. I'll handle it, he said. Whatever it takes. Nayeli's breath wavered. Zeke, if they find me here, they'll drag trouble right to your door. That ain't your burden to carry. Her chest tightened. No one had ever told her that before. You're not trouble, he said. The men hunting you are. That's on them. A gust blew in hard. She pulled the blanket tighter. Zeke shifted closer, standing between her and the wind, shielding her with nothing but his frame. No touch, just presence. After a long moment, she whispered, I don't know when I'm supposed to leave. You're not, he said simply. Not unless you want to. She blinked, tears threatening. You mean I can stay, as long as I choose? He met her eyes, steady and sure, and nodded once. Then stay, he said. No bargain, no price, just your choice. That moment, bare, open, held more warmth than the fire inside. And suddenly Nayeli felt something unfamiliar stir in her chest. Trust. Not because he'd rescued her, not because he'd fed or sheltered her, but because for the first time in years, someone gave her the right to choose her own road. Inside, the fire crackled in the stove. Zeke held the door for her, and she stepped through, not out of fear, but because she wanted to. For both of them, it didn't feel like surrender. It felt like something beginning. The days that followed settled into a rhythm as natural as wind across the ridge. Zeke rose early, checked the horizon like clockwork. The tracks from before had been scoured clean by frost and time. No fresh ones showed. Each morning, Nayeli tested her steps. Further, steadier. Breaths came easier now, ribs healing. She still clung to the blanket, but her posture changed. More sure. Less haunted. And when she walked, she no longer looked behind her. Zeke noticed that too, and without saying a word, something in him finally let go of the knot he didn't even know he'd been carrying. The inside of the cabin started changing too. Bit by bit, almost like the wind had shifted. Nayeli, quiet and careful, began straightening things up. She folded the blankets into neat squares, shifted the tin cups to a handier spot, lined up the shelves without making a fuss. It wasn't pushy. It was the way someone moves when they're trying to show respect for another person's space. And somehow, Zeke Callahan noticed every little thing she did. He never said a word about it, but he'd catch himself glancing at the shelves now and again, noticing how right it all looked now. One evening, with the stove humming low and the wind easing outside, Nayeli sat slicing potatoes with a slow, steady rhythm. Zeke was across from her, patching a torn glove, his hands moving with quiet purpose. Neither of them talked much. They didn't need to. The silence between them had settled into something comfortable. When she was done, she laid the knife down gentle and placed her hands on the table. Zeke, she said softly. He lifted his eyes to her, waiting. I've been thinking, she began, voice barely above a whisper. About leaving. Then she shook her head. And I realized, I don't want to. Zeke didn't flinch, didn't speak right away. He just looked at her. Calm. Still. She swallowed. Not because I'm afraid, but because I just don't want to go. Zeke set the glove aside, his face unreadable. Then he exhaled, slow and sure, like something inside him had settled. You don't have to, he said. You're safe here, and you're not taking up any space I want back. Her eyes shimmered, not with tears, but with something heavier. The kind of relief that comes when you hear the words you'd been too afraid to ask for. When I ran, she whispered, I never thought I'd find a place where I was allowed to stay. Zeke looked at her with that quiet steadiness of his. You've earned your place, he said. Then, gentler still, but you don't have to earn anything with me. She lowered her gaze, trying to steady her breath. The weight of the moment clung to her chest. If I stay, what happens next? Zeke rose from his chair, stepped closer, not touching, but close enough that she could feel the warmth roll off him. That depends, he said, on what you want. I want... Her voice caught. Words were hard when you'd had your choices stolen so many times. But she tried again. I want to build something. A life not ruled by fear. I want to build it with you. His jaw flexed, not from doubt, but from the weight of what she'd just offered. He stepped in closer, eyes locked on hers. "Are you asking to stay here?" he asked low. "Yes," she breathed. "As my partner?" She nodded, her voice shaking. "If you'll have me." Zeke lifted a hand slowly, careful as the sunrise, and tucked a loose strand of her hair behind her ear. The touch was soft, almost shy, but full of meaning. "Nayeli," he said, "you're already part of this place, part of my days, part of the quiet. I don't want you to leave." She let out a shaky breath. Her ribs still ached, but something inside her, something long buried, felt lighter. He stepped in until they shared the same air. And for the first time, Zeke allowed the wall to fall. Let her see the hope, the warmth, the deep-set relief in his eyes. Nayeli placed her hand gently over his chest, feeling the steady rhythm beneath her palm. Zeke didn't pull away. He covered her hand with his, holding it there. "Will you stay by choice?" he asked. "Yes," she said, voice clear now. He leaned down and touched his forehead to hers. No rush, no demand. Just two souls grounding each other. Outside, the wind shifted direction again, but neither of them noticed. They were in their own quiet storm. When spring crept back into the valley, the land woke up. Green returned in patches. Birds came back to nest. The frost started to fade from the soil. Together they repaired the fence line, widened the garden, rebuilt the corral rail that had leaned all winter long. Zeke taught Nayeli how to read storm signs in the clouds. She showed him how to weave cord from softened bark. They cooked shoulder to shoulder, walked the ridge trails, sat by the stove in peaceful silence. One morning, beneath a wide sky tinged with warmth, Zeke stood on the porch with her. He reached for her hand and laced his fingers through hers. She looked up, a little surprised. Zeke wasn't a man of sudden gestures, but she didn't pull away. "Nayeli," he said, his voice hushed. "I've lived alone a long while. Thought that's just how it had to be." She waited, heart caught in her throat. "But you changed that," he said, "without asking for anything, without even trying." She moved a step closer, gripping his hand tighter. "I want this to be home," he said, "for both of us. If you'll be my wife." Nayeli let out a soft breath. No hesitation. No fear. "Yes," she said, steady as the morning sun. "I will." Zeke pulled her into his arms. No urgency, just the kind of embrace that says everything without speaking a word. The cold world beyond didn't feel so empty anymore. The cabin wasn't just a roof. It was theirs now, built not from need or survival, but from choice, from trust. Two lives, once splintered and scattered, now stood side by side, not because they had to, but because they chose to. And they stayed. "Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Thank you for being here and letting this story live within your heart. If it moved you, I hope you'll walk beside us through more journeys of the Wild West. Stories filled with truth, endurance, and grace. Subscribe, share your thoughts, and stay close. Together we'll keep riding across these wide-open lands of memory and hope. Thank you. Aviso legal. Disclaimer. Our narratives bring inspiration from the past, recreated with fictional and dramatized interpretations for entertainment purposes only. AI tools serve as creative support, but the storytelling, editing, and emotional refinement are handled by our team to guarantee authenticity. We comply with content policies for AI use, avoiding impersonations, identity fabrication, or historically misleading images. All visual and audio content is legally sourced. Redistribution or modification requires prior written approval. Thank you for honoring creativity, collaboration, and storytelling done with heart.